you. Can everybody hear me? Excellent, that's a good start. I think this one does work. Thank you for those kind words, and thank you for coming out on a Sunday evening when you could be studying, watching TV, or in the pub. I'm very grateful. I'm going to talk for sort of 15, 20 minutes, a little bit about my background, a bit about sovereignty, about democracy, about the referendum campaign, about the Brexit Party, and what's going to happen next. And frankly, who knows? But who am I? I've been involved in the world of business for over 30 years. I've been a director of over 100 companies across 4 continents, a dozen countries, including a billion-pound multinational stock market listed business. I then decided that I needed to get involved in politics, and my word, nothing in life prepares you for life at the sharp end of politics. It is a dirty, devious game, that is for sure. Yeah, that's been quite an eye-opener. But I've been deeply Eurosceptic for over 20 years. I was involved in the campaign in the late 1990s, not for the UK not to join the euro. And thank heavens, despite all the pleading of big business, of the big business lobbying groups, the pleading of Tony Blair, thank heavens for Gordon Brown, who kept us out of the euro. So that was a huge plus. If we'd gone into the euro, the crash in the UK in 2008 would have been significantly deeper. The pain would have been very much greater. And the reason I didn't want to join the euro is actually brings me on to the next point, the whole issue of sovereignty. Actually, you need to be in control of your own destiny. I'm a great believer in pushing power down as devolving power as close as possible to the people. And let's remember that sovereignty in a nation belongs to the people. And in the UK, we give that sovereignty to our elected parliament every 5 years. We then have a general election. And at that general election, what happens is Parliament, the MPs, give that sovereignty back to the people, who then decide who to lend that sovereignty to for the next 5 years. But what happened when Parliament, over a couple of decades, gave away permanently chunks of that sovereignty to Brussels? That is the key thing. Once you've given it to Brussels, it's impossible, virtually impossible, to get it back, unless you do what we're trying to do, which is to leave the EU. So I believe passionately that sovereignty belongs to the people. You lend it for an electoral term, say it's 5 years in the UK, and then you give it back to the people. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why I've always wanted to leave the European Union, been so anxious about the quantity of power that was permanently given, not lent, given to Brussels. So that key issue of sovereignty for me is very, very important. And you remember the slogan that during the referendum campaign was used was bringing back control of our laws, money and borders. All about control and sovereignty. So that was a key thing. Now, who here voted in the referendum? Probably about a third. Out of interest, was there anybody who could vote in the referendum but didn't? No, that's a good start. Fine. It brings me on to the second thing, which is democracy. Democracy is an incredible thing and a huge, huge privilege that we enjoy. I actually believe that it's such a privilege that we should have a system like Australia, where you're obliged to vote. Once you get to the ballot box, you can abstain, but actually, as a matter of mark of respect for those who gave their lives and fought for us to have that democratic right, I believe that democracy is incredibly important. And the joy of in the EU. But the key point is, it would have been implemented. When you have a general election, whoever wins becomes the government. So the vote is implemented. You have to have a thing, for a democracy to work successfully, you have to have a thing called loser's consent. The loser has to accept, didn't get it right that time, didn't convince enough people, I've lost that one, got to do better next time. That is the whole key to success in democracy. And if you don't have loser's consent, then actually you lose trust in democracy. And what's happened in the 3.25 years since the EU referendum is that there's been a serious erosion of trust in democracy in this country, because the people were promised by the government that they would carry it out, and they haven't. And that is really, really serious. Trust in our democracy is the absolute bedrock of our society. Absolutely fundamental. Anyone here on the People's March yesterday? Excellent. Did you have fun? Great. And it's, the joy of protest, and I think it's by and large, with a few exceptions, peaceful protest, that is part of our right in a democratic society. And let's take the last referendum we had, which was in 2011, to do with whether or not we should change our voting system from first past the post to some form of proportional representation. The vote was held. Actually, the turnout then was disappointingly poor, in the low 40s%. It was, but there was a referendum. The decision was made. The decision was to stick with the system we've got. Sure, have a review after 10 or 15 years. And I think there is growing pressure to have a review of our voting system. We can come back to that later. That's fine, but you have to implement the first decision. In that case, the decision was implemented, stick as you are. If Remain had won in 2016, it would have been implemented, stay as you are. But leave one, folks. And if you don't implement that decision, you utterly destroy trust in democracy. And millions of people will say, what is the point of ever voting again? And that would be an absolute tragedy. So I've always said, I've no problem at all having a second review of the decision to leave the EU after 10, 15 years down the track, by which time it would have been an incredible success story. No problem at all, but you have to implement it in the first time. Otherwise, what sort of democracy do we live in? So, I've talked about sovereignty, I've talked about the power of democracy, and this week is a big week, and there might well be a vote in the House of Commons to have a second referendum, what they sort of cunningly call a confirmatory referendum. It's a second referendum, folks. Okay, let's say that wins, and we have a second referendum. In the unlikely event that Remain wins, so folks, it's 1-1. Is it the best of 3 or the best of 5? How ridiculous, absurd would we look as a nation? Just think about that. If you have a second referendum and it's 1-1, why should we stop there? We on the Leave side wouldn't stop that. We wouldn't accept that. Think about it. This is democracy. It's really important. Businesses make important economic judgments based on the stability of a country. And if we're going to go through the next 5 years, every couple of years, having another referendum on this issue, then our economy will struggle. Global investors will not invest. You will not get the sort of jobs that you want to get, that you expect and want to get afterwards. You have to create trust and stability in our economy, in our society, and that is all based around democracy. And if we touch on the referendum campaign itself. Now, some people like referendums, some people don't. I I actually do, because I think what we've learned, and we've learned some lessons from that referendum campaign, but what we've really learned is that people actually liked having that vote. Some 72% of people voted, much higher than the average turnout in a general election. That's a good thing. Countries like Switzerland, they have lots of referendums. In various states around America, they have lots of referendums. I would like more. One of the Brexit Party's domestic policies is actually that we want much more direct democracy. If people don't like or trust our politicians in Westminster, let's have more referendums. So we want a referendum on the House of Lords after a national debate. We want a referendum about PR again, 10 years after the previous vote. We want a national conversation and then perhaps a referendum about the BBC, that sort of thing. I would quite like a national debate and a referendum about decriminalising or legalising cannabis. That's the sort of thing that actually we as a nation should talk about and have a big national debate. Do we really trust our politicians and the elite in Westminster on these big key issues? So I like referendum, as long as we have the confidence to then carry out the decision of the people. There were lessons learned from that campaign. I actually thought David Cameron, he had a bit of a shocker, frankly. What he should have done, it's perfectly fair for him to say his view, a few times so that people knew his view, but then he should have acted in a much more referee, presidential style and then he could have called out both sides of the campaign when, frankly, they were making claims that, didn't stack up. That would have been a much better way to do it, and I think the campaign would have been better run. There was stuff said on both sides that people subsequently, feel, some people say the number on the bus was wrong. We say Project Fear was a bunch of lies by the establishment, by multinationals, by the President of the United States, who came over here and said we're going to be at the back of the queue, and all this stuff. And so it went on. There was stuff said on both sides that actually, really was misleading. So, but we never stop learning. Here in this great university, you're learning. I'm 55. I'm still learning. We never stop learning in life. And as we have more referendums, let's learn from them. Just because you didn't like the way that one went and the tone of it, that doesn't mean it's bad to have referendums. Let's have them. Let's get more people engaged in politics, in democracy. Let's learn from it and maybe do it a bit better. So, how am I doing for time? Doing well. So then we'll move on to the Brexit Party. The Brexit Party was launched on the 12th of April, about 28, 29 weeks ago, as a result of the failure of the UK government, the Conservative government, to carry out the will of the people. And, Theresa May had promised over 100 times that we were leaving on the 29th of March. We didn't. Then it was the 12th of April. We didn't. So we launched the Brexit Party. And we didn't know how successful it would be. But 6 weeks later, we'd won a national election. That's a global first for a new political party to win a national election 6 weeks later. We then became the biggest party in the European Parliament with 29 MEPs. It's a bit weird, I'll admit, being hired for a job that I want to be fired from as quickly as possible. Most people actually want to stay in a job more than just a few months. We got 50% more votes than any other political party in this country. We got more votes than the Labour Party and the Conservative Party put together. So, there was we captured a mood. We captured a sense of frustration. We turned Brexiteers' anger into hope. And in a democracy that believes in peaceful protest, like the march yesterday, actually, that's what we want. We want hope. We want peaceful protest through walking down streets, and then through through voting in the ballot box. And there are times when, as we've recently seen, the level of division, the tone has degenerated. And that's not good. You know, we hold rallies around the country. We've had about 12 since the beginning of September. And when you get people, it's fine to protest outside, but do you really need to call us Nazis, scum, to lie on the street, to stop our supporters coming into the car park so that they can attend a peaceful rally? Is that really how we want to conduct ourselves in a civilized, democratic society, the mother of all democracies? I would suggest no. So we won that national election. We then announced our first domestic policies at the end of June, which would make, and it's always important to work out how you're going to pay for things. We said we would scrap HS2, that saves 100 billion quid. We wouldn't send 39 billion quid to Brussels, and we would redirect 50% of our foreign aid budget back into public services in the UK, so that we could invest 100 billion quid. That's real money, folks. It's taxpayers' cash. It's not government money. That's your cash. It's your friends' cash. It's your parents' cash. It's taxpayers' money. The regions have had 4 times less investment per head than London. And that's the reason why their infrastructure is creaking. That's the reason why we need to pour billions of pounds into regional road and rail schemes around the country, which will make much more difference to people's daily lives. Digital infrastructure. I want free Wi-Fi on all public transport around the whole of the country, not just on the London Tube and a few coaches going from Cambridge to Oxford. I want it on buses and trams all over the country, particularly in the areas that have been left behind. We want, at the Brexit Party, we want to invest in young people. That's why I wrote a report about 2 years ago about the lack of value in universities. I think it's a disgrace that the average teaching time in universities up and down the country is 11 hours a week, 23 weeks a year. Far too many university degrees are a rip-off. The biggest rip-off is the rate of interest, which is why one of our policies is to have 0 interest on student loans into the future and to scrap all the historic interest. It's not fair on young people that you get burdened with that huge interest at 6% when the government's borrowing now 30-year money at 1%. Of course, give or take 55 to 60% of young people don't go to university. So we need to have a much simpler, more effective apprentice scheme that is easy for businesses, small, medium and large, to use, implement and benefit from so that they take on apprenticeships. The tragedy is the government put on recently, a couple of years ago, a thing called the apprenticeship levy for medium and large businesses, and it's complex, it's convoluted, it's hard to use, and guess what's happened? With 30% less apprenticeships, approximately, than there were 3 or 4 years ago. A nice idea, badly implemented. We want to invest in small businesses all over beaches in Vietnam. These are the sort of important issues that I know is really, really important. So we've got a growing range of domestic policies. We don't release them all at once. It's amazing how many of our policies the Tories have nicked. It's fine, imitation is a form of flattery. You know, they've started to talk about possibly scrapping HS2. They've started to talk about possibly abolishing inheritance tax. That's one of our policies because it's the most unfair, hated, unpopular tax in this country. So the Brexit Party has been busy. We stood on a simple slogan of changing politics for good. I think it's a good thing we got rid of the worst Prime Minister this country's ever had the misfortune to have in Theresa May, as well as the least talented cabinet that this country has ever had. So we've started to make change. Without the Brexit Party, whether you like him or not, Boris Johnson would not be Prime Minister of this country. Probably Theresa May still would be, and we'd be in the middle of an incredibly ugly, divisive, brutal second referendum campaign. So we've started to change politics for good, in our opinion. And that brings us now to the present day. And what a moment it is. I mean, yesterday was supposed to be Super Saturday. Turned out to be a bit of a damp squid. Parliamentary games were played. The whole country was sort of built up, led up the hill by Johnson. And then MPs dashed it with parliamentary games. That's what's happened. So we've no idea what's going to happen. The Speaker may not even allow this week a vote on this new deal. He may not even allow it. There may well be an amendment this week on that motion for Boris's new deal to have a second referendum. And I think that will be really close. All of these votes will be incredibly close. But there could be a vote on Boris's deal, and it might go through. So there's an extraordinary range of scenarios. But if Boris's deal does go through as a motion, there's then what they call the implementation bill, which is where they actually debate and possibly amend the Withdrawal Act. And that could go on for weeks. There could be loads and loads of amendments. People who don't want to leave the EU, they might be able to pass amendments saying we want a softer Brexit, we want to stay in the customs union. That's not Brexit at all. So it's a complete mystery what's going to happen. But it's an interesting, fascinating, extraordinary time to be involved in changing the course of history and have no doubt how big a deal this is. This is as big as when Churchill was battling to prevent appeasement in the late 1930s. This is as big as the Corn Laws in the 1850s, when the elite, the aristocrats, were imposing huge tariffs on the most vulnerable, the poorest in society. This is as big as when Wilberforce, in the early 1800s, took on the establishment in order to ban slavery. This is a big deal. So it's right, that there's lots of discussion about it. But when you fundamentally come back to trust in democracy, you have to carry out the will of the people, otherwise you utterly betray that trust, and that would be a tragedy. How have I done for time?
Yeah, so I just have a few questions, and then I'll open the floor up to questions. I know you guys probably have a lot of them. So my first one is something you didn't quite address in your speech. What exactly is the Brexit Party's position on the deal presently on the table?
You're quite right. I should have done, shouldn't I? A glaring omission. So we stand for what we call a clean break Brexit. That means that we have a clean break. We don't have what may be a 1-year transition period or a 3-year transition period. It means we can instantly start negotiating and implementing trade deals around the world. It means that we can instantly start to change regulations, get rid of the daft one, keep the smart ones. It means we can instantly start to protect and invest in strategically important national industries under what's called state aid, which is prevented at the moment, things like steel, defence, railways, key strategic issues. It means we don't have to spend 39 billion quid that even the House of Lords in their own report said we didn't have to do. It means we can adjust our economic policies urgently and quickly. So we can have a clean break. That means everybody knows where you are and we can maximise the advantages. We can do trade deals around the world. And importantly, it means that actually we've got much more negotiating leverage with the EU. So we stand for a clean break Brexit. The issue with Boris's deal is that it's a reheated version of Theresa May's deal. And it's full of traps and pitfalls. And the idea of having a level playing field where actually you can't get rid of the daft regulations. We can't try and make ourselves a much more competitive economy. We believe in the Brexit Party. We want to be a high-growth, low-tax, smartly regulated economy that can therefore grow much faster, which will increase the wealth of everybody and will benefit the least well-off in society the most.
Yeah, so just to delve into a couple of aspects of this clean break. So particularly you said that one of the aspects would be to, as you said, instantly start negotiating and implementing trade deals. Most trade deals take quite a few years to actually negotiate. Then they have to be ratified, and of course implementation takes some time. As a function of being in the EU, the UK doesn't have much experience with doing this. So don't you think some transition period might actually be a good thing to give us the time to negotiate these deals before we start trading immediately?
So the thing about the transition period is we would have left the EU, but in that period we're still subject to whatever new rules and regulations the EU decides. That means we've got no voice, no veto, no say. They can continue to plunder and pillage our fishing waters for years to come. Whereas actually we want to take back control. The whole point of it is so that we can control access to our fishing waters. And the thing about trade deals is that when it's a one-to-one between one country and another country, it's much easier to do quickly. Australia did a trade deal with the US, 10 months. The EU took 7 years with Canada because it's a massive bun fight and a series of compromises between 28 different countries. And where people get hung up with these trade deals is you don't have to agree the whole lot in one go. You can do partial trade deals for some of the easy stuff. Look, some of the stuff is difficult. So we might say, people get terribly excited about chlorinated chicken and US food standards. You might say, politically, we can't deal with that moment.Ut that in the too difficult box. But you might say, folks, it's not fair, it's ludicrous that currently the EU charges a 10% tariff on US cars coming into the EU, but the US only charges 2.5% on EU cars going to the US. Wouldn't be difficult to sort out that, to build some trust with some quick, partial trade deals on individual sectors and then move on to the other issues. And as for we haven't got the experience, look, frankly, I simply don't buy that. I mean, there are so many good people in the business world who would love to come in and help. It's actually not that difficult. I've spoken to trade negotiators from elsewhere in the world who've said it's not that difficult. Combination of UK business people, and we could hire some trade negotiators from elsewhere, and actually it's doable. I'm a great believer. I'm an optimist. My glass is always half full. It's never half empty.
So again, expand on one of those points. Again, assuming we get a trade deal in 10 months, again, we do have to do dozens of these potentially, so it will take some time. But in terms of the immediate aftermath of, as you say, clean break, we've seen Operation Yellowhammer predictions of what will happen, particularly at our ports. Implementing customs check will massively slow down imports into this country, most particularly those of essential medicine, certain foods, particularly perishables, etc. So what do you suggest in this particular period? Before we've got the trade deals in place, it will take time to kind of negotiate what these new arrangements will be like. If we don't have a transition period, what will we have as opposed to just chaos?
So firstly, you've bought into Project Fear Mark 3, 4 or 5. I've lost count, frankly. Firstly, let's take Dover and Calais. The head of both ports have confirmed that there will be no additional checks. The arrangements are in place. Right? The way business works, folks, is businesses want to sell goods to other businesses or to consumers because what do they want to do? They want to make profits. The idea that European businesses don't want to sell us medicines and pharmaceuticals, of course they do. They want to make profits. One of my fellow Brexit Party MEPs was in France a few weeks back. He's a medical doctor. He was at a conference. 4 separate senior executives from French pharmaceutical firms came up to him and said, this is a complete nonsense. Of course we're going to sell you medicines, and of course we want to do so to continue to make profits. This is all just garbage that's been dreamt up by the same woeful people who dreamt up project fear number one. It simply isn't true. You shouldn't believe it. Ignore it. It's nonsense. Now, the thing about the trade deal. So, many of you will have heard of the World Trade Organization, shortened to the WTO. There's a thing under WTO called Article 24, where basically what you do is between two countries, you reach a heads of terms agreement that you want a trade deal. The moment you've reached a heads of terms, you can actually then have the access arrangements. 0 tariffs or very low tariffs, 0 quotas or very low quotas. Whilst you spend 1 or 2, sometimes 3 years dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the actual contract. So you can agree the heads of terms, you can implement it immediately. That requires, obviously, it requires an agreement, but that sort of thing can really be done quite quickly. And it was interesting that when I went to the WTO back in January now, they said that what is called the political declaration, which was about 29 pages, with goodwill on both sides, that could be turned into a heads of terms agreement, an Article 24 WTO agreement, literally in the space of a fortnight. You know, and I'm in the world of business. There's nothing like a short deadline, actually, to concentrate the minds, focus the attention, and get a deal done.
Well, I'm sure the audience has many questions, so I'm going to open questions up to the floor. Please raise your hands if you have any questions, and a steward will bring you a microphone. It's over there.
Thank you. Hi. Much like yourself, I agree that it's very important to speak to people who have different opinions to yourself. And so for that, I'd like to thank you for coming to Cambridge and having a chat with us. Some very interesting points. Now, I'd just like to flip back the time a bit to your introduction. So you speak about how you've been a director for many companies and you've been a CEO for a listed company which has been worth over £1 billion. The logical question following on from that is, aren't you part of the establishment that you and your party berated in the 2016 referendum?
No, it's a really good question, to which I would answer, no. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a businessman. When we talk about the establishment, we talk about the big multinationals, the big corporate lobbying groups, and the politicians in Westminster and the institutions around that. That's what I mean by the establishment, and no, I'm not a part of that. But look, it's a valid question. What's your definition of a big business? But I think on the basis that I've been sort of battling against the tide for the last 20 years, you know, I've very much adopted a anti-establishment view on you know, how we should be running and governing the country going forwards.
Thank you. So, what if we take the scenario that you know, Dominic Raab said on Andrew Marr this morning, the deal might get through. So let's say it does. Will the Brexit Party still exist a week from now? And if it does, will it sort of maintain the sort of economic nationalist positions you set out, which I think would be attractive to a lot of people, or will you sort of retreat back to the sort of fringe group that you might have been without this crisis?
No, it's a great question, and the simple answer is we're not retreating anywhere. We absolutely believe in our economic policies. We believe they are common sense policies. They're neither left, they're neither right. They're common sense that actually will work better for the people, and they need to be properly implemented. But most importantly of all, if it does go through, and it may well, I don't know any more than you, it's going to be really close. We think that it'll be between 5 and 10 votes in the House of Commons, so it's pretty close. If it does go through, then and they get through the legislation, the implementing bill, which is a massive ask in the space of a couple of weeks. Otherwise, you're into an extension. Who knows how long that'll be? Then our job is actually to hold the government to account because of the traps and pitfalls that we see. We want to make sure that actually, you know, our fishing communities, our coastal communities, get back control of our waters. So we want to hold the government account to make sure that in a future free trade deal, they don't sell off a load of the quotas to EU countries as part of the free trade arrangement. So that's a big, big thing. We want to make sure that actually, we can not be forced to have a level playing field. We want to make sure that we're not handcuffed to EU foreign policy and to this growing EU defence army that they're building. These are really key things. They are huge risks. So we need to make sure that we hold the government to account so that we get a really good free trade deal. Because if we don't, no one else will.
Thank you. I find it quite interesting that you talk about sort of coastal towns reclaiming control as though it's going to be positive for them. I come from a coastal town in North Wales, and 60% of Welsh exports are done with the EU, and literally 20 miles down the road is Holyhead. And so to leave on no deal would be catastrophic for North Wales, in that 60% of its exports would be lost because of the unfavourable terms that would be mandated under WTO rules. So WT tariff on beef is around about 64%, which is substantially higher than what it stands under the trade deal we currently have. Also, the fact would be that WTO rules leaving on a no deal would effectively put a hard border between the Irish Sea, and it also put a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which would cut one of the most vital trade routes for North Wales. So the Brexit Party line on Brexit would pretty much strangle one of the main regional areas in our country. I just wonder, where does that come from?
The simple answer to that is that the joy about taking back control is that we've got control, and presumably when you talk about exports, you in particular talk about lamb and beef. Right, we've got control then of our own agricultural policy. So we can provide the essential support that almost all developed countries provide to their farming communities, but at least now it would be our decision. So yes, we would need to ensure that short to medium-term support is provided to those farming communities, in particular the Welsh lamb farmers and things, but markets adapt and markets adjust. One of the things about food is, in the 1980s, we used to produce 80% of what we consume. That figure now is less than 60%. I think it's about 55%. So actually, what we really need to do is we need to be consuming a lot more of the lamb and the beef that we produce, because that actually, that's good for our economy, it's actually good for the environment. And I'm glad you raised the point about the Irish border, because I didn't touch on that. And this is really, really important. The current government proposal essentially is actually to split the United Kingdom, and that's why the DUP are planning to vote against it. We know them very well, because essentially it creates a border that doesn't exist between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But let me talk about the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. The EU's own expert, a guy called Lars Carlson, who's a world customs expert, he wrote a report for the European Parliament, 47 pages or something, that I have read, in November 2017. And he said that under any trading arrangement scenario, existing technologies, existing international best practice could provide a friction-free border. What has happened is that the previous Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, who said, with goodwill and technology, we can avoid the need for any checks on the Irish border. The current Taoiseach adopted a much more aggressive, nationalistic approach to the negotiations, and that is why we've got this situation. But let me tell you about this Irish border. There are currently 5 different things across that border. Different currency, different VAT rate, different excise duty on things like booze and fags, different income tax, and different company tax. Why, ladies and gentlemen, should a 6th thing, potentially different rules and regulations on goods, why should that make any difference whatsoever? When you can use existing technology that we all enjoy. I'm sure some of you, you get goods, Amazon, whatever, Netflix, from Amazon, let's say, delivered to your room. And you can track it from the moment it's left the factory or the warehouse to your room. You can do that with goods between a factory in Northern Ireland and a factory in Southern Ireland. It's called electronic declarations. That's what happens all over the world. But absurdly, our UK civil servants, under Theresa May, totally failed to put this forward as a solution because they wanted to create difficulties, to make this too difficult, so that basically we would stay handcuffed. That's what they did. I think it's disgraceful. It's a complete betrayal of our national interest. And that's why we've ended up in this situation. And look, the Taoiseach is negotiating for Ireland, and he's done a fantastic job. And our negotiators have utterly failed.
You talked about wanting to have more referendums because you learn from them, and lending the sovereignty to the people, not taking it, and also how the people have been misled. So now that the people have realised they've been misled and would like to take back the sovereignty that they have lent to you, to have another referendum from which you can learn more and continue the ongoing process of democracy, you're saying no, and I just think that's a bit hypocritical. I'm wondering how you actually think that's justifiable.
So the whole point of it is that when I talk about lending it from the people, you lend it to the government every 5 years, and then the government gives it back at the end of an electoral term. With a referendum, actually what happens is that the government basically outsources that decision back to the people. That's what a referendum is. The government said, we want you, the people, to decide, not us, the government. And the people decided, folks, and were promised that it would be carried out. And I respectfully don't accept that people were misled. We were told that the decision would be carried out. It was a once-in-a-generation decision, and people have a right to trust that that would be done. And as I said earlier, absolutely fine. Have a review after 10 or 15 years later, but you have to implement the first decision first.
Just on something you said then, you did say earlier that you thought that there have been misleading statements on both sides of the campaign. So, again, you're saying that you don't think people were misled. I'm just wondering how you could reconcile what you said previously with what you just said.
So look, the overall macro thing of whether or not people were misled, they weren't. Taking back control of laws, trade and borders, having the sovereignty, that is what actually you're bringing power back from Brussels, back to our government, or indeed back to, you might devolve it back to Scotland, you might devolve it to Wales, you might devolve it to Northern Ireland. You're bringing power back. That was the fundamental concept. That was the big debate. We would be in control of our own decisions. People were not misled about that. There were certain statements that I was specifically referring to about, was 350 million the right number? Project Fear's numbers about losing 500,000 jobs, all this stuff. Some of those, on both sides, were, they were misleading. And that's why I feel actually the lesson to learn, as I said earlier, is to have some form of impartial ref that can call out something when you just say, look, actually, that's not right. But you've got to be prepared to learn the lessons rather than not have it in the first place.
More questions?
How would you propose implementing a clean break Brexit if you were in Boris Johnson's current position?
So we would leave on the 31st of October. And actually the government has done a good job since Boris became Prime Minister in progressing the preparations for no deal. And there are some, give or take, 100 individual agreements lined up and in place. And actually, the EU, they suddenly realised that Boris was serious about no deal. And so they put in place the preparations. And the EU said, on their own side, we're ready. Well, it's two sides of the same coin. If they're ready and comfortable, that means actually we're ready. The Governor of the Bank of England a couple of months ago, said that over 80% of businesses that export were ready. I would say to the other 15 or 20%, folks, you've had 3 years to get ready. And the thing is, Parliament voted, not once, but twice. When it voted to serve Article 50, to leave on the 29th of March, that was leaving with or without a deal. When it passed the European Withdrawal Act in 2018, to leave on March the 29th, it didn't say as long as we've got a deal, folks. Parliament voted to leave with or without a deal. So actually, everybody's had plenty of notices, plenty of time to get ready. The government under Theresa May failed to get ready. This government has started to get ready.
I just wanted to ask a bit more about this analogy between the referendum and then the general election. So you're saying that when a general election is decided, we don't go back on it, there's winners and losers. But also you don't have a general election 10 or 15 years after you've made that decision. You have it 4 years, 5 years after. So we'd actually be coming up to another general election right now, wouldn't we? So do you think that democracy, in the way you spoke about it, is a one-time decision that is irreversible and that people can't think about again? Or do you think that democracy is a continuous process where you think about it throughout time, not just as a single moment? I don't know, I just wanted to ask you about that, really. I said it to a statement.
You're quite right that a general election, whatever the electoral term is, but you haven't implemented it. You've had a general election. The winner has taken the spoils and becomes the government. We've had a referendum, and we've faffed around for 3 years. We haven't done it. And that comes back to this trust point. It's just not right to say, I'll tell you what, folks, I'll abide by a general election. I'll tell the people in a referendum that we're going to implement the decision. I'll tell them how long that decision lasts. It's a generation. And then say, actually, you got it wrong, folks. You didn't listen to us. So we're not going to implement that one. It just doesn't work. It's a bit like people in the Labour Party today who are calling for a second referendum. But they won't implement the first one. And even though they could, they won't actually hold a general election. So it's like they might trust the people on a second referendum, but currently they're not prepared to trust the people on a general election to get rid of this absurd zombie parliament we've got. You know, they're calling for Boris to resign on one hand, but they won't sack him on the other. So I think the analogy is fair. When you have a general election, you implement it. If you have a referendum and you tell people you're going to implement it, then implement it. If you tell people we want to have a referendum to get your sense of direction on something, which may be what you might do if you had a national debate about legalizing some drugs, for example. You might say, let's get people's mood on it and then, take time to look at it. That's different. But if you tell people you're going to implement it and you don't, you have a complete breakdown of trust.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Stand by.
Thank you. Just a quick question on the matter of sovereignty, where you spoke about how we give up sovereignty to the EU, when in fact what we do is pool it. Because as a logical extension of the idea of individual sovereignty being paramount, it's entirely equally reasonable for me to say that we should leave the EU as it is for me to say that Harrogate and Knaresborough constituency, where I live, should break apart from the other 649, because I don't get a say over all of those. So one distinction is just as arbitrary as the other, but we accept that pooled sovereignty is good because it means that we have a greater fiscal clout, it means we have a greater political presence on the world stage, and it means we have a greater geographical area for the free movements that the customs union enjoys. So I wonder, why is national unity any less arbitrary than European Union unity?
Because fundamentally, you've actually just conceded that you are pooling sovereignty. So you're giving it away. And the whole point is that most decisions in the EU, and having been over there as an MEP, I can tell you, most decisions are taken behind closed doors by the Commission officials, not by the elected MEPs. We act as a sort of fig leaf of democracy, a rubber stamp. But if you've pooled your sovereignty, you've accepted that actually you've given some of it away. And the thing is, you can't take it back. And there used to be a veto on almost everything, a national veto, which was a bit better. But that's gone on almost, most of it now. So you've actually given it away and you can't get it back. And I'm a great believer. I don't accept at all that the EU economically is better for us. I believe that actually the best decision making is taken as close as possible to the people. That's why I believe in devolution. I think we should be putting many more powers to Holyrood in Scotland, to Wales in Cardiff, and indeed to Stormont, because I think that way you'll get better decision making of spending our individual taxpayers' cash. And you talk about the good example, I didn't hear which constituency, but the constituency example is a good one. You get local councils, you get parish councils, and actually some really good work and decisions can be made at those levels. And if there was more power at those levels, I actually believe you'd get more people interested in local democracy and trying to help. So that's why I just believe in pushing as much power as close to the people as possible.
Hi. Hi. First, thank you for coming along and talking tonight. My question was, if there's a second referendum and Remain wins, will the Brexit Party support the will of the people in that second referendum?
Well, of course not. I mean, why would we? It's 1-1. I'll have a debate about whether it's the best of 3 or 5. But, hey folks, but you didn't accept the first one, so why should I accept the second one? But I do believe in the will of the people, and we spoke, and we expect it to be implemented. I'm very happy to have a debate about what is a generation. Should we review it after 10 or 15 or indeed 5 or 6 years? Let's have a debate about that. But for heaven's sake, implement the first decision first when you've promised people that you're going to do it. If the rules had been different, if the rules had said, this is a big decision, folks, we need a 55 or 60% majority, or we need to take a 2-year breather period to check, to look, to learn, fine, those are the rules. But if you set the rules and then you change the rules afterwards because you don't like it, because the wealthier, the smarter, the establishment don't like what the people told them, that's bad. That betrays trust in democracy. That's just not fair, that's not right. So have a second one after you've done it, 7, 10, 15 years down the track. By then we'll have made it such a roaring success, people won't want to look back, but happy to have a look. But carry it out the first time.
Well, that brings a conclusion to our questions in this event. On behalf of all of us at the Union, I want to thank you for coming to talk to us and take our questions. So I hope everybody will join me in a round of applause. Just a couple of notices before we go. Those who signed up for the meet and greet with Mr. Tice, again, you've gone the email about it. Please meet upstairs. We have a couple of events coming up I just want to talk about. Tomorrow we have 2 in a row. So at 5 p.m. we have Dua Lipa. At 7 p.m. we have George Takei. And then for the rest of the week, on Tuesday, we have a debate on nationalizing Eton. Thursday we have a debate on globalization. And then we have many more events for the rest of the term, as well as a few speakers to be announced in the coming days. Oh, and recently we have also announced on the 22nd So that's Tuesday as well. We're going to be having an opposition leader from Hong Kong in to speak. So that event is up on Facebook. Thank you all. Please allow us to leave before you go yourselves, and I hope you have a good evening.